My name is Tom Hornbein. I'm professor and former chair of the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of Washington, and I'm here at Stanford on this October 17 to interview Dr. Larry Saidman, who is professor and former chair of the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of California in San Diego, and also for a dozen years the editor of our leading journal, Anesthesiology. Good morning, Larry.
Good morning.
This is an adventure we're about to embark on, and I think the way I would suggest we start out is, at least the first question that aroused my curiosity is, what led you into anesthesiology? And would you be willing to maybe start somewhere before or after birth and take us into the directions that got you into the specialty of your passion?
I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and although anesthesia was not a concept in my early years, being a physician was something that I had wanted to do from the time I was a very young child. So there was never any question in my mind that I was going to be a doctor. I started medical school went to the University of Michigan as an undergrad, and went to medical school at the University of Michigan. And sometime in the course of my fourth year, when electives were part of a medical student's activity at that time, I was fortunate enough to be able to obtain an anesthesia elective. I say fortunate because anesthesia was then a section of surgery, and the way one obtained the various electives in surgery was you drew cards, believe it or not, and I drew an ace. Anesthesia was considered a desirable elective by the medical students, and I chose anesthesia and was kind of captured from that point on. Easy story.
Easy story. And keep going from there, as I know you ended up in San Francisco for your training in anesthesia, but how did that happen? I mean, that's where our lives, I think, first connected.
Well, I was very, as I think most medical students were in the late 50s and early 60s, I was very unsophisticated in terms of any life outside of Ann Arbor. When you grow up in Detroit, Ann Arbor is the place that you end up going most of the time. And I knew relatively little about the specialty in general, and so as an intern in Detroit, I was an intern at Sinai Hospital in Detroit, and having decided to go into anesthesia, I obtained what was then called the Green Book. It was a book put out by the AMA that listed all of the residencies in anesthesiology throughout the country. I knew little more about the specialty other than as you look through the Green Book, at that time there were some 3-year programs. Most programs were 2 years of training, as you know, and there were a few 3-year programs. And the extent of my sophistication was that it would seem to me that 3-year programs would be better than 2-year programs. So I asked my wife, and she was a major part of this decision, if she wanted to go to New York, Philadelphia, or San Francisco, because at that time that appeared to be the 3 major programs in the country. There were others, but as I said, I didn't know much about them. And for a couple of kids who had never ventured much very far out of Detroit or Ann Arbor or the Michigan area, San Francisco seemed like more of an adventure, and thus we chose to apply to San Francisco.
Let me back up just a little bit. I have 2 questions. The first is, tell me a little more about what it was about your exposure to anesthesia during your rotation that captivated you.
I think that which fascinated me more about the specialty than anything was the measure of control that a physician was able to achieve over a patient as a consequence of the things that we do and the drugs that we administer. It was almost an awesome experience certainly for a medical student, to have the kind of control that you could to render somebody unconscious, paralyzed, and totally under your, relying upon you for their safety, and at the same time being able to reverse those effects. It was something I'll never forget and was never able to get over. It's still, every time I give anesthesia now, it's still the same sort of sensation.
And now, I mean, then the control was a lot less than it is now, of course. And also, it sounds like you and Arlene met very early in your career. Tell me a little bit about how the two of you came together, and maybe that can lead us into what her influence on your destiny has been.
Well, interestingly, Arlene and I grew up 3 or 4 blocks away from each other in Detroit. We lived in the same area of Detroit, although we did not know each other during that time. We went to the same elementary school, the same high school, but I did not know her until after my junior year in college, just before I was to start medical school. We met one summer when we were both working at a day camp. I was the bus driver and she was a counselor, and we became, we would chat a bit while I was the bus driver, and interestingly I got fired from that job and was rehired back as a counselor about a week later. Toward the end of the summer, we had a summer picnic. I didn't have a date. She didn't have a date. I asked her if she was going with anyone. She said no. I said we should go together, and that was the beginning of this incredible relationship that's lasted 40 years.
Well, I won't ask you why you got fired as a bus driver, but we'll proceed onward from there. Tell me a little bit about life at the University of California, San Francisco.
Well, just getting there was kind of an adventure. As you know now, medical students take these tours around the country interviewing departments, department chairs, residents, etc. They may go to 5 or 10 different programs. We had very little money at that time, and certainly didn't know anything about traveling around the country. So I sent an application in the summer of 1961 and received a phone call. It was late summer, early fall. Received a phone call. I was home one afternoon. Stu Cullen was on the phone. We chatted for about 5 minutes, and he said, "You're accepted for residency." That was the extent of the interview process. I didn't go to San Francisco. He never saw me. I didn't meet any committee, but was accepted into what turned out to be the highlight, a program that meant the highlight of my life.
Life was simple in those days.
Very simple. There was something for simplicity.
And there, I think somewhere around 1963 or 64, we must have had our first encounter when I was there visiting.
You had just returned from Everest, or not long before.
That's probably right.
That's right. And you know, I arrived in San Francisco. It was in many ways the most extraordinary experience of my life and of our lives, of Arlene and mine. For you can imagine what it's like, a couple of Midwestern kids suddenly finding themselves in the midst of San Francisco. And from the first day that I began residency, I had no regrets. It was just the most thrilling, exciting experience to be part of that department, to be in on what I think was a major force in the development of the specialty, to be working with people like John Severinghaus and Ted Gers, and have a chair like Stu Cullen. It was a reawakening, an awakening in terms of my entire professional career. I had no hint before going to San Francisco of a career in academic medicine. I had little idea as to what it was, and I never had given it a thought. But during that first year of residency training, having met and starting to work with Ted in the laboratory, began to pique my interest in academic medicine, and I did a fellowship the second year, and from then on my career was never in doubt.
Well, looking at those 3 years, as you pointed out, in those days only 2 years of training was required in anesthesia, right. And the individual who would strike out for a 3rd year of experience was unusual. And it seems to me, as I know about you and have watched you as you sort of tried to grow up, that year that was sandwiched between the 2 clinical years was a spectacular experience. And the productivity in terms of, say, published papers that came out of it was awesome. But I think behind that were some very seminal events that set out what was to follow in your life. You want to talk about your life with people like Ted and John and, of course, Stu Cullen?
Well, it really is, I guess I'm having difficulty articulating it, for it was such an extraordinary experience for me. Ted Gers was and continues to be a close personal friend of mine, and of yours, obviously. And he was, it was an early time in his career. He had an enthusiasm at that time which he retains to this day. That's what, of course, one of the most attractive aspects of his personality. It's an enthusiasm for his work that he transmits to his fellows. I think there's something to be said for being in the right place at the right time. And UCSF in the early 60s was, in my opinion, one of the 2 or 3 important places to be in terms of development of the science of our specialty. It was there that the concept of MAC was born, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that. It was there that the whole area of pharmacokinetics of inhaled agents was not born, but certainly developed to a great extent, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that experience. So I was really, literally, in the right place at the right time, and the productivity that appears in the CV, in my CV, is really a consequence of just being associated with people like Gers and Severinghaus and several others whose careers were on the rise, and mine, I was fortunate enough, I said, to have a career that melded in with theirs at that time.
Now, when you finished your residency, you didn't stay in San Francisco.
Right.
I can imagine that after those 3 heady years, it would be hard to leave a place like that, but you chose to do so.
Well, in some respects, I had no choice. I had to go in the service.
Yes.
And I was in the Berry plan, as most young residents were at that time. And so I had 2 years to spend in the Air Force, and went to San Antonio, which was a fortunate opportunity for me, because it was the major teaching hospital of the Air Force, where they had residents, a residency training program. Interestingly, during the 2nd year of my experience in San Antonio, the 3 residents that came to the Air Force all ended up being department chairs of academic departments in the United States.
That's quite impressive.
It was very heady. It was very good.
And speaking of heady, you then headed from there to Miami?
Headed to Miami. I had a number of opportunities upon discharge from the Air Force. I considered going back to San Francisco. However, there were some personal reasons that led us to Miami. Frank Moya was the chairman of a department that was being developed. It appeared to be a department that was developing in the right directions. They had young men like Jerry Modell and Brad Smith and Gene Nagel and a number of others. And we had family in Miami. My wife and I are very family-oriented ourselves. And that and a number of other issues are what led me to ultimately make the decision to move to Miami.
Well, I can remember visiting you once in Miami during that period of time, and one of the things that struck me was that you were programmed by your training with Ted Gers in particular to, I guess, to the thinking of some of us who were into the lockstep to a career as a research anesthesiologist in a way. You were and he were the creators, if you will, of the concept of minimum anesthetic concentration that we all live with in our daily lives and our residents struggle with on the board exams. They don't really struggle with it, though. But you took a different path, and I never forgot that conversation we had where you described the sense of what you saw your directions in anesthesiology to be. Would you touch a little bit on at least these initial times in Miami, because I sense that they really helped define everything that's followed after that in certain ways.
Well, I think in some respects my career took a different course from that which a number of people had expected it would take. It's an important lesson, I think, as an aside, for young people, I believe, to not be so bound by what you think, by what it turns out to be that other people's expectations are of you. I think it's important to develop your own life and your own goals. And in too many cases, I see young people's careers affected adversely by their attempting to do that which other people expect of them. As you pointed out, I had had a very successful career as a resident, and people expected that I was going to continue, hopefully developing as an independent investigator, and having a career largely dominated by research. That turned out not to be the case. I think in part it was a result of that the success that I had was as a member of a team. Most research is collaborative, as you know, and I was a member of a team, and I never was able to recreate, in my mind, that same collaborative activity that I was able to, that was present in San Francisco. So my career as an investigator was not meteoric by any means. I did participate and perform some research throughout the succeeding years, but I think that the major part of my career was not as a consequence of being an independent investigator. I took different directions. I was active and interested in the educational process within our specialty, and ultimately becoming interested in the editorial process, and as you know, that'll come later perhaps in our discussion, assuming the editorship of the journal. I was also interested in the specialty as an organization, as an entity in and of itself, and have participated in the various activities of the specialty, including the American Board of Anesthesiology, activities which are far different, obviously, than an independent investigator in a laboratory.
Well, correct me, but one of the memories I had of that time was that you at that stage had already decided that one of your goals was to head a department of anesthesiology, and that you were preparing yourself in a sense of being, I'm not sure what the right word is, mentored, if you will, by your leaders there toward that goal. I was struck by it because it was the last thing in the world that I seemed to think I was interested in. And like most people, I just sort of backed into it later in my life. But I had the sense you had a direction and an intent to prepare your career, to make yourself able to do that which most of us sort of were really denying as a part of our future.
I suppose in some respects that's a consequence of who it is that you identify as your mentors and role models. And in most cases you attempt to emulate those individuals and what they've done. Although Ted was a mentor of mine and clearly never wanted, I think, to become a department chair. The others who were mentors at the same time, Stu Cullen, Jerry Modell, Manny Papper, were successful department chairs. And I suspect that their influence on my career and career development was greater than those people that were active in research at that time. It was something that I thought I could do. I think we tend to do that which we are comfortable with, and I thought that I could do that. And I guess I never thought that I would be, I never felt that I would be a successful independent investigator. I felt that that role was something that would suit me more.
What role did Arlene play in these transitions that were taking place then?
She's been an extraordinarily supportive mate for 40 years. Well, it's actually, we've been married 38 years. We've been together for 40. And although always agreeing to the various moves that we made as a consequence of what was best for my career. At the same time, she never failed to share in the decision and to give advice in terms of what she thought was appropriate, not only for me but for our lives. Mm-hmm. And the moves that we've made have, although on the one hand, a move is always disruptive. At the same time, each move that we've made has been a positive move in terms of our marital development and our family development. As I said, although difficult, at the same time they've resulted in an advance forward for our relationship.
Well, you know, it's been for me an educational and privileged experience to be able to follow that almost, well, from early on at least in anesthesia through to right now. Let's see, I guess we are in Miami, and the next move we're going to make is back to the West Coast.
Well, the difficulties arose in Miami. The nature of them isn't crucial for this discussion, but suffice it to say, I felt that it was time for me to leave after I had been there for 5 years. I had a number of opportunities, and among those opportunities was being a recruitment to the University of California at San Diego. At that time, the chair of the department was Henrik Ben Dixon, a charming, intelligent, worldly, respected individual. And I was attracted to Henrik and what he was trying to build at UCSD. It was a relatively new medical school, a very exciting place to be at the time. A school that, although in the reaches of the far west, was being developed on a model of Yale University School of Medicine. And I was convinced to join the faculty at UCSD. Interestingly, I joined there the first week in September 1972. And as I was walking into the office, having driven across the country, I was met at the door by Henrik, who had a bag packed, who was on his way to catch a plane to be interviewed for the chair at Columbia University. And again, it's a story of being in the right place at the right time. Not that I wished him to leave, quite the contrary. I was disappointed when he left. He agreed to be the chair at Columbia within several months of my joining the faculty at UCSD. And I was appointed acting chair several months later. And after a search for a year, was appointed chair in 1974.
So there was something prescient about what you did at Miami, but you had no sense when you were moving to San Diego.
How could you have predicted that?
This was going to be your fate.
That's right. So I became a chairman in 1974 at the age of 38.
Some would say too young.
Some would say too young. At the same time, you have a lot of energy when you're 38. Energy that you perhaps don't have when you wait to be a chairman into your 50s. And although you have energy, you obviously don't have the wisdom and experience that you otherwise might have. You have to balance one against the other. I think on balance it worked out well. But it certainly directed the course of my career at a very early time when, as you point out, some might have said it would have been appropriate to wait several years later.
So tell me a little bit about how your sense of what you wanted to accomplish and how it unfolded during this interval that began in 1972 as chair, and then when did you hang it up?
I joined the faculty in 72. I became the chairman in 1974.
74.
And I continued as chair until 1986. I accepted the chair in 1974, not with a grand plan. I don't think I've ever been what people refer to as a visionary. At least, I've never written down a vision. I think the department developed well. I was proud of what we created. We had a wonderful residency program. We developed some very fine young investigators, and I think we were among the leaders in the country, but it wasn't because I had a plan in 1974 that that's what it would be in 1980 or 1985. It just evolved. Again, I was in the right place at the right time. San Diego was very attractive. UCSD was in the midst of a wonderful building program. And the specialty, as you know, was becoming increasingly attractive, and so we were all able to attract high-quality residents, especially toward the late 70s and early to mid-80s. And it was almost difficult not to have wonderful trainees who ultimately turn into wonderful faculty.
One of the things I want to maybe jump back to is the evolution of this department at San Diego and how it related to the experience that you had under Stu Cullen when you were in San Francisco as a resident.
Well, Stuart was one of my early mentors. I have a picture of him. This is a picture of Stu Cullen when he had just accepted the chair at the University of Iowa. I believe this was taken in 1938.
So he accepted a chair at an early age too, obviously.
He accepted the chair immediately after completion of residency at New York University. Things were obviously much different in the specialty in the 1930s and 40s. This picture, incidentally, was given to me by Rod Calverley, an individual who is very active in the history of anesthesia, and it was given to me when I completed my tenure as chair at UCSD, and included with this is a list of all the residents who trained under me during that 12-year period.
Well, how lovely! I mean, I see Stu. I mean, having been privileged to know him, though never having trained under him. I mean, to me, he was really one of the greats of a generation of anesthesiologists, and it might be worth taking a look at the generation, because he came from Iowa, but before that he was part of a whole history that you too are attached to. I'm
not sure that this will come into focus on this tape. But what this is essentially a family tree of the specialty of anesthesia. So we have the trunk, Ralph Waters on the trunk. The major branches are Rovenstein, Drips, and as you can see from Rovenstein, there's a major Stuart Cullen branch, and from Stuart Cullen, Larry Saidman was represented as a leaf. So I'm derived from this Stu Cullen heritage, or actually originally from Ralph Waters. Stu Cullen was in some respects a simple person in terms of direct, and I think virtually guileless, at least to me. What you saw was what you got. He was honest. He had integrity, which was unsurpassed, and most importantly to me, he seemed an individual who wanted to encourage his disciples, his trainees, his faculty to develop to their greatest extent, and at the same time he never competed with them. It was a quality that I tried to emulate. I thought it was terribly important and resulted to me in the best quality faculty and residents that one could have. You should be in the background encouraging them, being a cheerleader, and not competing with their accomplishments. I always thought you should be as proud as you possibly could, as proud as you would be of your children, without attempting to compete with them. And that's what I loved about Stuart Cullen.
Well, I would have to say, without trying to embarrass you too much, that you learned some good lessons from him, because my impression of the way you functioned as chair at San Diego was exactly in that model. And Stu, of course, gained such trust and respect that he went on to be dean of the medical school at San Francisco for a while. To me, he was one of the great father figures, and a terrific one to have as a role model. I envy you that experience. What, after a dozen years, it looks like your life is divided into 12s.
That's
at least.
right.
Tell me about what took you from there then to the next passion in your life.
Well, in 1983, actually 1982, I was fortunate to be asked to join the editorial board of anesthesiology. It was an activity I hadn't thought about. Again, it was not something I had planned to do. I hadn't even thought about it. I was surprised one day. I was in the operating room, received a call from Jack Mitchenfelder, who asked me if I would be interested in joining the editorial board, and I was pleased and honored, and of course I said yes. I participated, I was immediately made editor of review articles for the journal, and participated as a member of the editorial board under Jack's tutelage or editorship. His tenure as the editor ended, was scheduled to end 3 years later. And after 2 years, he announced to the editorial board that he would be stepping down, and that those who were interested in becoming the editor should make their wishes known. Although I had not thought about it until that time. The idea of becoming editor was appealing to me. Jack was another role model for me, and I thrived under his mentorship. Again, I was impressed by his integrity and the way he managed the journal. And so I offered my name as a candidate for the editorship in 1985 and was elected as the editor of the journal. At that same time, I was elected as a director of the American Board of Anesthesiology. It was a busy year for me. And I had been the chair for, at that point, 11 years. And as you know, being a chairman of a busy clinical department can be a wearing experience. I felt that that the department had gone about as far as it could under my chairmanship at that time, and so it was having been elected as the editor and a director of the editor of the journal and director of the board. It was a good opportunity for a transition in my professional life to occur, and I announced my resignation from the chair in the winter of 1985.
I can remember conversations we had back around that time where you were entertaining what comes after life as a chair, right, having started so early, and the sense that that was something that you might continue to do until you were 60 or 65 or would retire, was becoming increasingly not a growing option. And so this opportunity to take on the editor-in-chiefship of the anesthesiology was like a gift from somewhere.
It was, again, I was in the right place at the right time. And it turned out to be clearly the highlight of my professional life.
I would, from just watching and reading, I would have to agree with you completely. I mean, it's like this is where all that had happened before unfolded. Tell us about the unfolding, about why this was really the highlight of your career.
Well, I suppose in some respects it's because I thought I could do it about as well as, better than I could do anything else. And I thought I was doing it as well as it probably could be done at the time. Now that's kind of, you know, it's maybe inappropriate to say that. I just felt comfortable. You know, there are things that you do that just fit. You are comfortable climbing up the side of a mountain where I wouldn't possibly want to find myself. I felt comfortable doing this job. I thought I knew what was involved. I thought I understood what the directions the journal needed to go. I began to understand the whole concept of peer review, not just for the journal, but for all scientific journals. I became interested in the associations that journal editors have, and participated in several of the international congresses on peer review. And I had some ideas as to which way the directions anesthesiology could lead the specialty. And it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to be editor of this journal and to exert some role in leadership of the specialty.
Now, a few moments ago, you characterized your time as chair of the department as not terribly visionary. You said things just sort of happened, unfolded. But what I've just heard you say, and I'm going to ask you to explore it in greater depth now, is a vision. Maybe not one that was there at all at the outset, but a real vibrant sense of directions for this activity that you were taking on.
You should misunderstand to some extent what I mean by that. I certainly don't mean that my predecessors were not very strong editors and very effective editors of the journal.
No, I think that as one looks back on them, they had visions too. But
I think they did.
But it's these transitions and evolutions that take us beyond where we've been before. And you clearly had a sense of something new, different that you would like to bring to the journal and
well,
use the journal
I had a wonderful editorial board who I think to some extent shared my vision of of what we would like the journal to mean to the specialty. At the time I became the editor, and for many years before, the journal had the reputation of, although it was acknowledged as a fine scientific journal, that it was one that largely would appeal to investigators, and especially laboratory investigators, and have less appeal to clinicians in the specialty. I don't think there was a fair rap necessarily, but that was the reputation that it had. And there were other journals in the specialty, as you know, that were thought of as more reader-friendly or more clinician-friendly. I believe we had a responsibility to attempt to turn that attitude around, and we made a number of changes, largely cosmetic, but changes that I believe were enormously influential in changing the attitudes of the clinical anesthesiologists in the society and worldwide. That Anesthesiologist was a journal that described important clinical contributions and advances to the same extent that it did laboratory investigations. And I think this was a major advance for the journal. We announced this intent in several editorials, reformatted the journal so that clinical investigations were at the front and the most noted, the most obvious section of the journal, and attempted to actively court good clinical investigators, both to the editorial board, to the associate editorial board as reviewers, and of course as authors for the journal. I considered that a crucial aspect of my editorial responsibilities, and I believe that we were successful as an editorial board and I as an editor in achieving this, not turnaround of the journal, but turnaround in attitudes of those who read the journal. I think the journal, as I said, that most of the changes were cosmetic, but our readership began to respond to these changes.
Sort of reminds me of the current changes in the New Yorker, and a lot of those are cosmetic too, but they've had a powerful impact on the readership.
That's right. I think that's right.
But also you became a voice through the journal. There are a series of editorials that you, or perhaps you with others, have written that are speaking to our specialty's culture, view of itself, its relationship to the rest of the world, and its morality, in a sense, if I can put it that strongly.
I think that's right. Our specialty, perhaps as much as any specialty, perhaps more than most, is inextricably linked to development of new drugs and instruments and techniques. And as a consequence, we have this long-standing and very tight relationship with pharmaceutical companies. Much of our research as a consequence of that is supported by pharmaceutical companies. And I became concerned, as did others, and it's a continuing issue, that this relationship, although on the one hand was very positive for the specialty, could at the same time have negative consequences for the specialty, for the journal, and for the investigators. And I attempted to be a voice to define the relationship as it should occur in its most to define the relationship as it should occur in the most legitimate form. A relationship that would result both in gains for the pharmaceutical industry and gains for the academic faculty that were involved in investigations conducted with these drugs. Without these guidelines, what can result is less than good research that does not benefit the pharmaceutical house, certainly doesn't benefit our patients, and doesn't result in the kind of the type of papers and advances that our academic faculty require. And so I've attempted both in public fora as well as on the editorial pages of the journal to articulate that which I think was appropriate for these relationships between our faculty and the pharmaceutical companies.
As we conclude this conversation, Larry, though we could go on forever, but not today, I would be curious, I'd like you to touch on, the specialty, where you see it's come from, but perhaps more importantly, and what your concerns are about its future and where it might be going, because these are among the things that you have really articulated in your writings and your speaking.
I have a number of thoughts about the specialty. First, the American Society of Anesthesiologists, which, as you know, is the parent organization of the specialty and the owner of the journal. As the editor of the journal, I actively participate in the business of the society, and wanted to emphasize the fact that before becoming the editor, I had little idea as to what the society was all about, and as the editor became enormously impressed that the conduct of business of our society is in very good hands. They're extremely committed, dedicated, hardworking individuals that have become active in and become the leaders of the specialty. And that was an eye-opener for me, for I had little idea, as most academics do, how committed and how hardworking and how intelligent and organized these leaders of our specialty are. Now, also as the editor of the journal, and having been a department chair and, as I said, a director of the American Board of Anesthesiology, I've had an opportunity to develop some thoughts about the directions that I think the specialty needs to pursue in the coming years. We are a specialty that is not well understood, even now, by a lot of specialists, a lot of non-anesthesiologist specialists. This was certainly true when I was a medical student. I knew nothing about the specialty. My mother was amazed, as a matter of fact, when I said I was going to become an anesthesiologist. She was concerned I wasn't going to have an office. And even now, there are many specialists in our hospitals that don't understand what it is that we do. And I think to some extent this is a consequence of our having kept our activities segregated to the operating room, and largely the operating room, although we've actively been involved in critical care, we're still perceived of as an operating room specialty. As you know, I developed a term several years ago, and I gave the 1994 Rovenstein Lecture of perioperative medicine and pain management as a term that better defines the scope of our specialty. And I sincerely believe that the specialty would be better served over the next generation if we began to expand our activities outside of the operating room to a greater extent than they are now, in all aspects of perioperative medicine. Although the term medicine might grate on some non-anesthesiologists, it's perioperative activities that I think will better define the scope of our specialty in the future, and that which I would like to see as the course of development of anesthesiology.
One final question, and that is, you've talked about the specialty. Can you Can you articulate a little bit about what the specialty has given you?
Well, specialty has given me a professional career that I could not have conceived of as a child, as a medical student. It's given me more than respect. It's given me a place. It's given me a place to practice medicine that provides me with a level of excitement on a daily basis that I couldn't have conceived possible. And it's still, at the age of 61, I find as exciting as it was 40 years ago, 35 years ago. I have a great debt of gratitude to the specialty and to the individuals who I've met over the years who've been leaders in the specialty, both as department chairs, as academic researchers, as leaders of our society. And obviously have a great debt to the specialty and to the personnel in it for the success that I've enjoyed.
Seems like a lovely quid pro quo, because it's worked both ways. The specialty is given to you, and you have given, in my opinion, some beautiful gifts to the specialty that we've both enjoyed for so many years.
Thank you.
Thanks a whole lot.
Thank you.